This story is all about connections. One person does something good in one area and another person hears about it and says, could I do something similar in my area with a similar problem? An individual or family is in dire need, facing the overpowering might of the state, and due to the internet can go online and immediately contact a helpline. One family flees to Ireland, receives help, goes back to school, and in turn can help others. This is also a story about two countries which have been entwined for almost 1,000 years, often in conflict with one in domination, but also for long periods in harmony, and with a special relationship such as at present no borders, freedom of movement, and virtual joint citizenship. But whereas for 150 years since the famine there has been a flight from Ireland to Britain for economic reasons, recently there has been a flight from Britain to Ireland for reasons seen to be the avoidance of persecution by the British state. Our first speaker is a famous songwriter and activist. Jonathan King is a singer-songwriter, record producer, music entrepreneur, and former television and radio presenter. Amongst his top hits are Everyone's Gone to the Moon and Una Paloma Blanca. In 2001, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for the sexual abuse of underage young men. Jonathan became one of the first of the high-profile celebrities to be accused of historical sex abuse. But in addition to widespread unease at the quality of evidence used against him, a recent book by Bob Wolfenden definitively demonstrates that this was a miscarriage of justice. Bob Wolfenden's book reveals the extent to which innocent people are imprisoned in British jails due to the inadequacy of the criminal justice system.
Looking at me, you would never think that I used to be one of the biggest pop stars, the most celebrated celebrities, the most featured on television stars of the 1960s, 70s, 80s and 90s in Great Britain. Well, actually, you'd be quite right. I wasn't that big a star. I had a few hits in the 60s and 70s, and indeed I had a very successful TV series in the 80s called Entertainment USA on the BBC. But actually, I wasn't a huge star. I was pretty successful, though. And I was rather surprised when in the year 2000, I became what somebody on YouTube has described as the test case for U-Tree, which was one of the very first celebrities to be targeted by the false allegations industry. It wasn't really an industry back then. It was essentially the police, and I think Surrey Police, who had decided that this was quite a clever way of raising their profile, getting easy convictions, and getting enormously increased budgets and promotions for top officers if they actually targeted famous people for sex offences of various kinds and managed to get them convicted and sent to prison. Funnily enough, I wasn't the first in Operation Arundel, as it was then called. The first two people who were arrested and charged with, arrested and questioned about sex offences were Paul Weller and Mick Hucknall. Remember Mick Hucknall of Simply Red and Paul Weller of The Jam and other great groups. Both of them were accused of rape of some woman in Surrey, separately of course. Both actually had the allegations dropped when the very expensive lawyers hit the police. But both, I think, saw the allegations dropped mainly because they were heterosexual allegations. They were against women, and I think somebody in the police force realised that it would be better to try and fit someone up who was either gay or bisexual, and they could accuse of allegations against men. As a result, I was arrested in November 2000, and there was a huge amount of publicity, which is exactly what the police wanted. And as a result, loads of other people came out of the woodwork, and I was rearrested again and charged eventually with various assorted counts of abuse going back years and years, nothing more recent than the late 80s, and most of them in the 60s and 70s. All of these were false allegations, by the way, but they made very good copy. The media adored the story. It was the front pages everywhere, about as much publicity as Jimmy Savile got years later when somebody accused him after his death. And indeed, the net result was I got sent to prison. Wrongly, I had not committed the crimes that I was convicted of, as has been clearly written about in hastily grabbed a book, the brilliant Nicholas Cases by Bob Woffenden, which actually covers the 10 worst miscarriages of justice, in his opinion, in the United Kingdom over the last 30 years. I was rather flattered to be included, and I have to say slightly surprised, because I've got to tell you, my rather trivial case of having had rather superficial relationships sexually with young men years earlier does not compare with the other 9 cases in the book, which are mainly murder and people who are still in prison to this day for crimes that they, in Bob Woffenden's opinion, did not commit. Anyway, that was the beginning of it all, back in 2000. It wasn't really the beginning. The sort of thing had been going on for years, but this was a good chance to start it all. By coincidence, or was it coincidence, 2 days after my arrest, the government was forced in Great Britain to equalise the ages of consent at 16. I've always been bisexual. I knew I was from an early age. In those days, being homosexual was completely illegal. If you had sex with another person of the same gender, you were committing a crime and you usually ended up in prison. So it was pretty serious stuff. But actually, the world and society was much more lenient because the majority of people realised or thought this was ludicrous, and that, by the way, includes the media, and as a result, just ignored it. So there were very few big stories in the tabloids or in the newspapers or even cases in court of homosexual offences. There were still quite a lot, but far fewer than you would imagine. The law was then changed and it was made legal to have sex with somebody of the same gender if you were both over 21. And I was only just over 21 at the time. And I felt that was absurd too, because a lot of my friends at that time were under 21. And the law was eventually changed in the 90s, believe it or not, to be legal if you had sex with somebody over 18. But even so, I thought that was mad. But by that point, I'd just about retired from the sexual arena, being far too old, as you can see. Eventually, 2 days after my arrest, coincidence, the law was equalised and made 16 for both genders. I'd always thought it was absurd that you could fall in love and they could fall in love with you with a girl of 16 and it was perfectly legal for decades. But if you happened to be the same gender as the other person, it was completely illegal until the year 2000. Anyway, I basically broke the law as it was then. I later discovered that actually, if you hadn't made a complaint within 12 months of that time, it was no longer considered a crime and it was wiped off the possibility of any kind of prosecution. But of course, you still could be prosecuted if the person involved was under 16. So police made it their business to make sure that people who claim to have been abused actually put their age down to under 16. As a matter of interest, when my case got heard, there was something called legal argument before the trial actually began, and the vast majority of my claims against me got thrown out by the judge. And indeed, after my trial, in which I was convicted for 5 men, all of which were wrong, I then had to suffer a second trial. In fact, there was even a third, fourth and fifth trial planned. In the second trial, I was acquitted on all charges because I was able to prove that I had not assaulted the men who were making the claims. So that one I was found not guilty. I was acquitted, and the judge then demanded that the prosecution dropped all the other allegations, and actually he said he would sentence me on the first verdict of the first trial as a sample for all of the 27 allegations, some of which I've been proved innocent on. I was rather furious about that. I thought, why not use the second trial that I was acquitted on as a sample? But that was the way the judge went, and as a result he gave me a very long sentence, much longer than the guidelines, which, believe it or not, at the time was 2 years maximum, and I was given 7 years, and I ended up in prison serving 3.5 years. I was quite upset at the time, as you'll understand, going to prison not only for crimes that I didn't commit, but crimes that had never happened. There was never any evidence that actually any of these things had happened. It was just their word against mine. And of course the prosecution, by managing to find 5 people who said similar kind of things, although actually they weren't that similar when it came down to the crunch, if you can excuse me using the word, I thought to myself, this is really wrong. The law should not be that just one person's word against another is counted as evidence and enough to convict someone. But it happened, and at the time I predicted that this could be an enormous avalanche of trouble for people, because if the police could get you convicted on something so easily, it was a great way to boost their figures and their conviction rates and get huge increase in budgets and promotion for senior officers, which is exactly what happened. In fact, the senior officer in charge of my case was given as a reward for being such an expert on paedophiles the Millie Dowler murder case. If you remember, Millie Dowler was a Surrey teenager who was murdered, and the inspector in charge of my case, Chief Inspector Brian Marjoram, who had become Chief Inspector because of him managing to get me convicted, was given the Millie Dowler case to head up. By the way, you can find out all about all of this, including my earlier comments about Mick Hucknall and Paul Weller, if you simply Google their names and add rape or whatever in their case, or even in Brian Marjoram's case. I suggest the words you should add there are Millie Dowler, or also, because it was quite an amusing side event, Matthew Kelly. Because when my appeal came up a year after my trial, after I'd been sitting in jail for a year, Surrey Police decided it would be a good idea to reactivate the publicity, and they accused Matthew Kelly of similar crimes, involving me as well. I'd never met the man, by the way, which did indeed get front page coverage and all the rest on the days before my appeal. So naturally, the judges threw my appeal out. And as another quite amusing side event, I later discovered that the judge in charge of my appeal had been at Cambridge with me, and not only that, but the two of us had had sex together, which was illegal at the time, and probably he was the one who would have been considered as the criminal since he was slightly older than me. But that's neither here nor there, just an amusing aside. Anyway, I came to the conclusion that this was insanity. I also met loads of other people, not celebrities in prison, who'd been stitched up in a similar kind of way. And I predicted that this was going to turn into an absolute avalanche when police discovered how easy it was to convict people, innocent or guilty, of these charges. And indeed, it did then start taking off. It took a little while. Still, non-celebrities got done quite frequently, but then eventually celebrities started getting done. And of course, the real key one that happened was when Jimmy Savile died. Because when he was dead, lots of people, lots of women, could come forwards and claim that when he'd been alive, he'd assaulted them. By the way, assaulting people was changing radically in the public mind, mainly thanks to the media. So assaulting people years ago in the 60s and 70s by kissing them on the cheek, or even worse, something dreadful like pinching a buttock, was now considered virtually rape. So times had changed, and a lot of people out there who may have been kissed on the cheeks or pinched on the buttock by someone like Jimmy Savile suddenly realised that they actually had been raped. And in their own sad little minds, they probably thought they had been raped, because that's the way the media had involved things, and that's the way one tends to exaggerate things as your life goes on. Remember, at the beginning of all this, I exaggerated my importance as a pop star and a celebrity and a TV person. So it's happily easy to do. Lots of us do tend to exaggerate encounters, especially with celebrities. You bump into somebody in McDonald's who happens to be buying a burger and is famous, and after you start telling the story that I saw so-and-so in McDonald's, it becomes, I had a long chat with so-and-so in McDonald's, and some years later you become absolutely firmly convinced that so-and-so and you were great close friends, whereas actually you just seen them in a McDonald's once, miles and miles away. Anyway, yes, so that's the way the mind tends to go. And with the morality changing and with lots of media publicity, because they realised that these were great stories, especially if celebrities were involved, they might as well encourage them. So the vile triumvirate of the media, the police, and the judiciary, which, don't forget, includes a lot of bent lawyers. When I say bent lawyers, I mean lawyers who are prepared to help people who make claims, and under the guise of saying, I believe every word you say, they actually just encourage or groom them into how they should put their story across to police, when they should burst into tears, and so on and so forth. Having said that, I would say that most of the people who make false allegations genuinely believe them, and certainly believe the exaggerations of them, and are not simply doing it for money, although of course that is another aspect, because compensation is paid by us, the state, to the victims, and I use the word in inverted commas, of various forms of sex abuse. Anyway, the result was that when Jimmy Savile got done by the newspapers, although never by the courts because he was dead by then, and you can't actually prosecute a dead person, loads of other celebrities also started getting done, one of which I have to admit I had a slight hand in, because one of the people who started off my whole thing had first been approached, indeed this was the thing that started the whole thing against me, had first been approached by a, inverted commas, victim, who, by the way, I'd never met. And that man was called Max Clifford. He was a public relations person, and he was an expert in these things, and he knew a good story when he saw one. And a good story to him was something that he could eventually get a hefty percentage of from his client. Well, he was one of the first to get done, because I'd had various people contact me and say, this is very hypocritical, because Max Clifford is known for having done all sorts of disgraceful things when he was a little younger. And indeed, he did get done and was sent to prison. And many others also got done. Stuart Hall, Gary Glitter, and loads of other celebrities, but many more non-celebrities. Even so, sometimes non-celebrities would get loads of publicity in the local papers if it was a vicar or a teacher or a foster parent or a care worker or someone like that. They would get large stories in the local papers, and lots of people who had nothing to do with them and had never even met them thought to themselves, hang on a moment, couple of £1,000 here in compensation. I'll chuck my name in too and say I was abused, or possibly had met the person, or possibly even had been abused, and decided that they were going to make a complaint, possibly inflated complaint. So I got released from prison halfway through my sentence, which was unheard of at the time. Nobody got first parole when they hadn't agreed that they were guilty and done all the sex offender therapy courses. I had so many sad people in their 70s and 80s sitting in my cell saying, Jonathan, I know that you're bisexual and you've admitted it. What should I say to these people? I've never fancied a man or a boy in my life. I'm happily married. I'm now doing X years in prison for assault on a choir boy, which I never did. But I've got to admit it, and I've got to say why I did it. Why would I want to do something like that? And how can I now say that I don't want to do it any longer? Madness. Alice in Wonderland. Anyway, I was released, as I said, on first parole and sent back out to the big wide world, which I did in a blaze of publicity again, strongly against all the legal advice, who said, keep your head down, go to ground and retire politely without any publicity. And I said, well, I've got to tell you, after my release, there ain't going to be any publicity. There'll be a lot when I'm released, and I want to encourage that as much as possible, because after that, the newspapers, the radio, and the TV aren't going to touch me, because I'm technically a vile pervert. I've been convicted unless and until I can get my appeal heard, and as a result, nobody will carry anything about me. But when I came out, there was a lot of publicity, and I started shouting very loudly that the situation is dreadful, and it encouraged false accusers, and there was an industry involving lawyers and police and CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, and also the judiciary, who I think were basically just lazy and couldn't be bothered. And also, don't forget, juries, when they hear these dreadful tales from women and men breaking down and the doc saying it's ruined my life and I can't go on, as opposed to the defence, which is usually, I didn't do it. Boring. Most juries tend to convict. So it was a terrible situation, and I felt so sorry for the many people I met when I was in prison who had really suffered from this and whose lives were wrecked, as indeed were their families and their friends, and most of them ended up coming out and not being able to do anything and dying. I was not going to keep a low profile, and fortunately for me, by that time we had something called the internet, and I was able to raise my profile enormously, even though the traditional media was not covering anything I said. My website, which is www.kingofhits.com, got literally thousands a day of people visiting and hearing and reading my side of the story. And indeed, I actually made a film, Vile Pervert the Musical. So far, over 2 million views. That's full views. That's for the 90-minute film. It's free of charge and it's available online, and it really put my side of the story across. And I've made a couple of other films since then, also putting my side of the story across. So my voice was being heard. It was being heard quite loudly, but not in the traditional media. But indeed, more and more celebrities and other people started getting done. But then what started to happen is the more and more ludicrous of these that started coming forwards out of U-Tree and other operations, the more acquittals or no further actions there were. People like Jimmy Tarbuck, Jim Davidson, various assorted celebrities who were arrested or questioned, or there was huge publicity about such things, and they all went nowhere. And more publicity started coming up about this. And indeed, not only such celebrities as that, including some of my friends, Paul Gambaccini, who was done, but then actually with no further action, Cliff Richard, lovely, nice man, also the same thing, got done by all this whole machine, and again, never had to suffer any charges. And this went on, and it was becoming ludicrous. And the main kick-in was when somebody called Nick, who is always called Nick in inverted commas, nobody knows why, I'll tell you why, because people who make these false allegations have a right to anonymity until death. So they get given silly names like Nick in inverted commas. And he made such absurd allegations against loads of people, including former Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath, that were provably lunatic, including murdering small boys. And when no bodies were found, and certain decent media outlets like Panorama investigated and found not only were there no bodies found, but there were no reports at the time in the local newspapers, no complaints to police, no investigations about these murders and so on, the whole case started falling apart. And a couple of the people who've been either arrested or questioned on these things at the same time, such as Harvey Proctor and Lord Bramall, our former defence chief, and loads of others like that, really made a fuss about this and said this is awful, it's ruining our lives for no reason. The stupid inspector in charge of the whole inquiry stood on the steps of Ted Heath's house and described Nick's allegations as credible and true before investigation. Well, fair enough, credible if he believed them, but true before investigation? Insanity! And in fact, so crazy were these allegations and so easily and quickly proven false that the head of the Met Police, Sir Bernard Hogan Howe, commissioned a top retired judge, Sir Richard Henriques, to look into the police behaviour into sex abuse claims, especially the ones in Operation Midland and another Operation Vincenti, which involved Leon Britton, a former minister, who actually died before he could be told that there was no truth in the claims against him either. And Sir Richard Henriques produced a report which I have to say is unbelievable. Let me please show it to you. Can you see that there? That is Sir Richard Henriques' report, which was delivered to the Met Police in November 2016. I have to say it's stunning because it includes 43 recommendations of how police should change their behaviour, many of which I've been moaning on and on and on about for now 17 years, since the year 2000, when I was wrongly arrested, wrongly convicted and spent time in prison. Stupid things like calling the claimants of these things victims when they weren't victims at all. They were just making the allegations. Some may have been true, some may have been false, but until you investigate, indeed, until you actually take somebody to court and prove it, they are not victims, they're complainants. And other things like the "you will be believed" philosophy that the police were pushing like mad, encouraging false accusers to come forth in their millions. All of those sort of things were criticised by Judge Sir Richard Henriques, who's a very, very prominent and, I have to say, very intelligent and good judge. His report is absolutely scathing about the way police have been behaving in these sex abuse allegations and cases. And is well worth reading, by the way. You must get hold of a copy and read every single word of it, because it does go into great detail and it is shocking. Now, my hope is that that will change the way things are, and that therefore fewer people will be prosecuted for events that never happened. Having said that, that's my hope. I've been hoping it and shouting about it for 17 years. Whether or not my hope will be justified, we will have to wait and see. But in the meantime, whilst it's still going on, people are still trying to find ways for innocent people to escape the horrible aspect of convictions and long prison sentences for crimes that not only did they never commit, but that never took place.
Here in Ireland, there is a network involved in helping families to flee from Britain to prevent their children being wrongfully removed by the state. The reason I can say wrongfully with confidence is that the courts in the countries they flee to, such as Ireland, are allowing them to stay with their parents. This network, called ectopia.org, is coordinated by retired writer and journalist Brian Rothery, who lives here in County Wexford in Ireland.
There are hundreds of British families living here in Ireland who have fled here to prevent their children being seized by social services, placed into foster care and then moved on to forced adoption. My estimate is that of all the parents who flee from Britain for this reason, over 90% come here to Ireland and 10% go to France and Spain and to other countries. These are couples with children, women whose partners have either left them or stayed behind, with the woman coming here with her children, or girls and young women who are heavily pregnant coming here to have their babies which would certainly be seized at birth had they stayed back in Britain. Over the last 4 years that I've been helping families, I have received over 400 requests from families for help. And if you count the children, this would be almost 1,000 people. And of that 400, over 100 families with their children have come here to Ireland. They come by various routes, but mainly they come here through this harbour behind me, Rosslare Harbour. And they come either by car off the ferry or foot passengers. When they come off the car, I meet them at the very first service station at the top of a hill below where I'm standing. And when I meet them as foot passengers, I meet them as they come off the ramp right down in the terminal. Invariably, as they first place their feet on Irish soil, the woman bursts into tears. The children arrive tired and pale, silent and frightened. This old farmhouse in County Wexford is the first point of rest for many of the families that have fled here through Rosslare Harbour. We are about 14 miles from Rosslare Harbour at this point here. What these families need when they first arrive is they need what we've come to call the breathing space. That's to get over their panic and their fright, to get some rest, to start thinking straight, because believe me, they're not thinking straight at this stage, and to give us their files so that we can go through their paperwork and work out the rights and wrongs of the case. We're now in the backyard of my house, which was an old farmyard, as you can see, and behind me here is a restored stable, which has become known over the past few years as a safe house, where families used to stay. Now it's no longer a safe house for two very good reasons. One, because of all the publicity that it has received, but the second very important reason is that this is the very first place that the Irish police come to look for missing families. And when I say missing families, these are families advertised as missing persons, in quotes, and the police are coming to do welfare checks, in quotes. In fact, what they're doing is they're coming to do the work of the social workers and to hunt them down and seize them. Now, I must quickly add that the Irish police are very polite and very friendly when they come to do this job, and they don't like the job very much. They do not like taking children from families. But I wish I could say the same about the Irish social workers, who more often than not are just only too happy to assist their British colleagues in this task. A British minister in charge of child protection has claimed that Britain has the most robust child protection system in Europe. And I have been challenged with this more than once on public broadcasts. And my response has been, well, this may be so, but Britain is the only country in Europe from which families are fleeing. So how do we help these families when they arrive here? Well, ironically, and perhaps fittingly, the social workers in Britain are actually our best allies in this respect, helped at times by the social workers here in Ireland. Because these social workers have so much power and so much arrogance and so little accountability, and are protected by secrecy, the secrecy of the family courts, for example, and have the police at their beck and call, that they become so arrogant that they make very many mistakes, not just in their own breaching their own guidelines, but actually breaking the law. So we have used the law against them to great effect, because what we do is our legal experts work out all the mistakes they've made, and we take these to the High Court, where we invariably find that families get justice. Over the 4 years that I have been coordinating the Help Network here in Ireland, something very interesting has happened. British and Irish media and European media and even international media, mainly television stations, but also radio and journalists, have been coming here to this old farmyard to film this building behind me and to interview families. When the media first showed interest, and showed a lot of interest, we assumed that the main focus was the fleeing families, because fleeing families are very dramatic and very exciting and very tragic. But then fairly quickly we realised that what the media was really attracted to was the semi-clandestine network helping them. The fact that we had people prepared to help these people in a semi-secret way. That's what was so newsworthy, and that was what was very much attracting the television cameras. Now the sad news is that out of every family, every 5 families that contact us looking for help, we can only help 1. And the reason for this is that it takes money and a lot of energy and a lot of ingenuity in some cases to actually come to Ireland and set up a new life here. And there are no benefits here for 2 years, so 4 out of every 5 families can't do this, stay in Britain, and in fact lose their children. And this is a tragedy, and this is something that certainly we're not proud of. But it's because we can help 1 in 5, and because out of the 100 families that came here in the last 4 years, let's say they averaged 3 children each, that's 300 children and 400 British people altogether, joining hundreds if not thousands already here. As these children grow up here, and as they are doing quite happily, and not being taken, not being seized by the authorities, and go to university, they're going to be asking, why did our parents have to run? And at that point, sometime in the future, hopefully, the law and the draconian attitude of the British social workers towards families will change.
So we've heard from Jonathan and Brian. Is there a connection between them, apart from the fact they happen to know each other? There is an intriguing connection and an intriguing possibility. A little over a year before this film was made, Paul Gambaccini, who was a friend of Jonathan King's, wrote a book about his ordeal as a falsely accused celebrity and his near destruction by the British police. Adrian Hardiman, a distinguished Irish Supreme Court judge, wrote a review of the book, criticising, amongst several elements, the abandonment of the presumption of innocence in historical sex abuse allegations in Britain, especially against elderly celebrities. Crucially, he also speculated about whether this and the police tactics used could happen in Ireland. Judge Hardiman's review was seen and read by Jonathan King and discussed with Paul Gambaccini. It was also read by our people in the Help Network here in Ireland. As the implications began to sink in, a question was raised. Could the procedure being used successfully in Ireland to stop British children being seized from their parents also be used to assist celebrities, football coaches, and other similar individuals from unjust shaming, social ruin, and even wrongful conviction and imprisonment? I come now to our third speaker, who I hope will answer those questions. We believe that it is wise to not yet reveal his identity, because what is now being proposed may be quite newsworthy, and we are anxious not to offend the judiciary here in Ireland by appearing to be presumptuous. The British families fleeing here have found justice, and we believe that those who are being falsely accused have a much better chance of receiving justice here also. How do you interpret what is happening with the abuse scandals involving celebrities and coaches?
The biggest problem is that justice has been manipulated, whether that's by the police, the CPS or the courts. A witch hunt's developed where the issues of evidence are apparently being placed behind the need for the authorities' need, in the largest sense, to make amends for the politically held belief of grave failures of the past. As Nietzsche said, people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed.
You have experience of helping families against social services where similar spectral evidence and opinion is used to remove children from loving homes. Do you see a similarity?
Yes, and it works in a very similar way. If the lie, misrepresentation or opinion is expressed enough, it becomes believed without consideration of the actual evidence available. It's not just me who says this, but as Dr. Walter Barker, Director of Child Development Programme at Bristol University, pointed out, the very fact of suspicion that someone may abuse their child creates subconscious barriers and hostile feelings for most people who work with such families. In these circumstances, historical allegations are given some sort of gravitas by media sensationalism and, unfortunately, the dictum of "you will be believed" by the police and CPS. We've got to ask the question, how can anyone accused have access to a fair hearing where the supposed impartial and objective investigators are going to act in a way that is anything but impartial or objective? It looks to all intents and purposes that the law has changed its position to guilty unless you can prove otherwise. I suggest the burden of proof has been artificially shifted.
Do you think the same principles that have helped support families facing social services in the courts could be used or adapted to those subject to false or historical allegations?
Well, I always say that the law can work for everyone, and frequently there are options and remedies that can be utilised to challenge what may be happening to an individual. The danger can be that legal advice is to simply let the issue run and challenge only within the procedures that the individual's faced with. But in all reality, there are frequently other legal avenues that can help support an individual's defence or even undermine a case against an individual.
So would those accused falsely need to follow in many families' footsteps and flee to Ireland, for example?
I don't believe it would be a necessity, though no doubt it would open up another range of options that we could utilise against the system. The key is attempting to help any such accused individual would actually be to look at the process and the evidence being used. We're really talking about the processes involved that have been increasingly misused, basically to secure convictions. What is clear is that the basis of criminal law, innocent until proven guilty, has become lost in a social insanity, where the media manipulate a story, help the police troll for victims, and what appears to be desire to save face for failures to prosecute genuine cases in the past.
Do you believe there is a way to fight back against this social insanity, as you call it?
Yes, we will be treading unproven ground though, and effectively we will be creating test cases, which I suspect we'd probably have to take all the way to the ECJ and the ECHR. But I believe there are genuine challenges to the police procedures, the CPS charging policy, and the nature of evidence allowed in the courts to convict individuals simply on the victim's say-so.
What convinces you that this is a real possibility?
I think what many of us suspected has been borne out by the Enriquez report into the Metropolitan Police handling of Operation Midland, and in the sage words of Justice Hardiman, Supreme Court judge in Ireland. He did a review of Paul Gambaccini's book about his experience under Operation Yewtree. Both of these people demonstrate the clear line of travel that's become the norm for the authorities in the UK, taking allegations at face value and prosecuting it despite the lack of candour of the nature of the evidence. There's clearly been a breach of process in many instances, and by that I mean the legal principle. The rights to a fair trial have been circumvented, and in some instances by a lack of full disclosure. And I personally suggest trial by media, because despite judges' warnings and the supposed independence of a jury, whilst ever the hysteria has been writ large across the press, it cannot help but inculcate itself with an individual's opinion, and that opinion is highly influenced by the social insanity that's been attached to child protection and abuse scandals at this moment in time.
So hopefully we can conclude from this that justice can be found in Ireland.